Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to another episode of the Artsy Raven. Today, our special guest is Jenny Heijun Wills. As a transnational adoptee, Jenny has spent her life navigating the spaces of race and ethnicity. As a pan-polyam individual, she occupies a liminality between family, adopted, biological, chosen, and community, heteronormativity and queerness, commitment, and a constellation of love. As a person who self-harms to cope with mental illness, she moves between the desire to be beautiful and the urge to make herself ugly, longing for visibility while daily wishing her body would disappear. Well, this is pretty heavy stuff. And as a parent with a lifelong eating disorder, her love language is to feed, and she finds it near impossible to consume anything herself. These facets of Jenny's personhood have served as both the anchor she has clung to in the time before self-discovery and understanding, and the harsh parameters of what others now imagine she can be. So welcome, Jenny.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for our conversation.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into writing like essays and poetry and books.
Yeah, so it was a little bit on accident that I became a creative writer. So I was trained as an academic in English literature. So I think that there's sort of a natural connection that way. But I was kind of feeling not necessarily uncomfortable in an easy sense, but just maybe that academic writing was too difficult for me, or it wasn't very comfortable for me in the way that for some people it seems to be. And so while I had some time away from the university, I was on sabbatical, I started writing these prose poems unintentionally, but with an eye towards, the kinds of texts that have been written about experiences like mine. And in the end, those prose poems became the basis for my first book, which was a memoir. And so that's what spurred all of this. And then once I think I got a taste of how delicious creative writing can be, I've never looked back. And I've not just run, I've sprinted from academic writing ever since.
You have a pretty, well, it's an incredible story. I mean, you were adopted, you were born in Korea, and then I guess adopted by Canadian family. And you grew up, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Kitchener, Ontario, so not far from Toronto. And at the time, it looked very different. Whenever I go back to visit my family now, Kitchener Waterloo has such a different
Oh my
vibe.
God, so Asian now.
Yeah,
Like bubble tea, because I went to Waterloo and I don't remember there being any bubble tea, but yeah.
exactly. So I think that I would have appreciated a little bit more of that Asian sort of presence, but also diversity from around the world. When I was growing up, it looks very different now than my experience in the 80s there.
Well, I was flipping through your latest book. I have an arc, and yeah, and you were talking about, growing up and how you knew you were different, and well, because you were adopted into a non-Korean family, so it's kind of I don't know. Growing up in my family, I thought I wanted to be adopted, actually. Maybe I'm
Oh,
the opposite. I'm always like, oh, I'm so different. Like nobody else reads in my family, and I'm always like, oh, maybe there's another family out there waiting for me. That's my real family. So it's sort of
right.
a different experience than yours. Um,
I
but
think
how
Freud
do you, yeah,
family romance, right? Wasn't that the family romance by Freud? Like this idea
yes.
that child imagines the myth of an alternate family or an alternate what if life, maybe.
Yeah. And growing up, I mean, I read like a bunch of Sweet Valley High books until I kind of discovered, I'm not gonna be blonde and 5'8". There's just destroyed the mythology for me after a while. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, when you grow up, you're supposed to be this perfect person, but and then
Well,
over the course of time, yeah, it doesn't happen that way.
I mean, I think we readjust what our understanding of perfection is to be
hmm
over time.
hmm
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your journey. So does anyone in your family read some of your works?
Yeah. So from what I understand, my Canadian family has many members of my Canadian family read my first book. No one's read the second one yet. I haven't really shared that with many people. But the family in which I grew up, they did read the first one. I assume that they'll read the second. Here in my family in Winnipeg, my eldest has read both books now. So, but of course, that's a very different experience, being a parent as opposed to being an adopted youth, I think. Yeah.
So, you have 3 kids?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess, I mean, for them, it'll be a very different experience than yours growing up, since, well, in a way, I don't know, like when you were growing up, did you find it like it was a mystery that you wanted to solve to find your birth parents, or did you not think about them too much?
Yeah, I think for a lot of, especially maybe transnationally adopted youths, but for probably adopted youths of all sort of configurations, there can be sort of a paradox between having those intense, curious feelings and that intense sort of ontological drive, like that identity drive, particularly when you're racially and culturally different than the people in your surroundings. Um, but there was also alternatively the piece of not wanting to do harm, not wanting to be rejected again, the overwhelming complexity and feelings of impossibility of making connections, especially when you don't speak the same language or have any access to those folks. It feels like a universe away. And so it's a navigating, I think, of these desires, these very valid and I think justified desires for connections, but also the fear element of it and the defensiveness and the protectiveness of your own self, but also like the people around you, the imagined mythical people of your biological origins. It's a lot of it's a heavy stone.
Um, okay, yeah, because I started when I was reading the beginning, I was like, oh no, it sounds like you could reconnected with your family, but things didn't, like you said, there's a mythological fantasy, and then people aren't perfect. So I do hope that well, now you have 2 moms, so that's fantastic, and then in the future you'll reconnect and have fun with your children, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, kinship is always complicated. I think when it's weighted with trauma, all adoption begins with trauma. Even as a motivator before the adoption, there's often trauma. At the very least, oppression and marginalization. And so for me, like making those connections are still invaluable, but also one needs to have the generosity to understand the limitations of all humans, including oneself and the flaws that we have and the faults that we make.
Oh, was it very difficult to write about your experiences in your memoir?
No,
No.
no. Um,
Okay.
I think I think of writing in a very technical way in a lot of cases. So it's a sort of combination of very emotive spurrings or inspirations. That's such a corny word though. But you know what I mean, like antecedents, I guess, to these scenes. Those feel very emotional and very sensorial. But then I do think about literature and writing from an extremely methodological place. And so I think that for me, at least the way that my brain functions, that creates kind of a boundary between the emotional so-called catharsis of the act and the end product. And so it's a little bit more emotional when I read back certain passages that I've written, but the act of writing always feels very deliberate and conscious and strategic.
Now, in your latest book, like Everything and Nothing at All, I noticed you had different passages of like media. Like there was Princess Diana wearing a Chinese skirt and like mentions of different, I guess, times when like Asians, like there's Asian culture, but the Asian people aren't there. So I thought it was very interesting how you picked out these specific passages. Like, what message do you want to send to the readers in this book?
Yeah, thanks. So in that opening essay, which is called Pretty, I'm trying to think about um, both the ways that aesthetics are used against us and the ways that we use aesthetics for survival and resistance and pleasure and celebration, and how often those things are conflicting and in contradiction, but that it is okay to exist beyond or within these binary understandings of things. These sort of uh, contextual anchors, I guess is a way to put them, that you're gesturing to these linear sort of placeholders were intended, they were a suggestion of both of my editors who are brilliant, brilliant people to find a way to ground this sweeping history of me thinking about aesthetics and beauty and fashion and those elements, trying to find a way to link those particular moments in my historical experience to what was going on in the world. And the decisions that I made were also somewhat reflective of the size of my world or my ideological world at those times. So the earlier sort of contextual anchors gesture to a lot of sort of Eurocentric things, um, indicate the limitations, I think, of what I had experienced as an Asian young person growing up in a white family in a white community where race was not a topic of conversation. And so as that linearity progresses, you see that there become references to broader scopes. So I think a little bit more about Asia. I think about how Asians are represented diasporically as I come closer to the present. And that is also a parallel to what I was thinking and learning about. And that sort of not awakening, because that also sounds, I think, a little bit limited and teleological, but a growing awareness, I think, of what it means to be in an Asian femme body in this world and how it's part of a much broader and many conversations that surpass, just a small enclave of media to which I was exposed in my youth.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there was one point where you're talking about, I think you were a waitress, and then there was someone making not very nice remarks. And then I was talking to someone the other day. I was like, yeah, growing up, like, don't you remember getting flashed by old white men all the time? And they're like, no. And I was like, oh, okay, that was part of my childhood. So I was like, it's just, I didn't really think about it. Like, I don't know why they did it, or because
Mhm.
I just looked dumb. I don't know. Like, it
But
just happens so often. I was sort of like, oh, why am I always a target? So it's very
I mean,
strange.
I think that people become different kinds of targets for these acts of like violent, like sexual violence, really, because of, the ways that certain experiences are considered empowered or gain their empowerment through the oppression of others. And one of the things that I tried to gesture to, which isn't original at all, but in this first chapter, Pretty, is the way that this is part of like the colonial discourses that see Asian femmes, Asian women, Asian non-binary individuals as disposable, as consumable, as oppressible, all of these things. There's centuries long legacy of this. So I'm sorry that that happened. Like it's devastating, and I think that a lot of us share that sort of normalization of these acts of violence because of the way we've consumed these narratives and also been treated our entire lives.
Definitely. And I mean, we're talking uh like May is Asian Heritage Month, but I don't think like there are
Mhm.
events, but at the same time, it's not celebrated as much as other months. I mean, it's just I don't know. Oh gosh, I don't know if it's also because it's a whole. There's so many different types of Asian cultures as well, and for myself, I'm Chinese, but we're used to not being individualistic and not speaking up. So there's different cultural aspects, I think, that complicates things as well. Um, so what is your next project you hope to do?
Hmm. Well, I've been thinking, so I'm always trying to go into fiction writing. I am writing short stories, but in the back of my mind is another nonfiction project, maybe the third and final nonfiction project. We'll see. That's about, I've come to this place where I'm really thinking a lot about neurodivergence and race and gender and sexuality and adoption, and what it means for me to be, diagnosed as neurodivergent. Not that diagnoses are that relevant, I don't think personally, but to go back and think about some of the assumptions I have about race, some of the assumptions I had about like assimilation and mimicry and comfort and feeling foreign and alienated and all of those things, and how they're connected to elements of OCD, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, those kinds of elements, and what is masking, what is stimming, how do these things square with one another? So I'm thinking about that right now and trying to imagine, maybe, I don't know, I'm trying to imagine what form would best suit that kind of interrogation or that kind of journey of thinking. So that's what I'm working on right now. It's still very early. This next book hasn't even yet, so I think I need to brace myself for that, and then also be, starting to lay out the research groundwork or something.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to reading more of your work.
Oh, thanks.
So, Jenny, you're going to do a bit of a reading for us. Can you tell us what you're reading and a bit of context before you start?
Sure. So this is the introduction to the essay that we've been discussing called Pretty. That is the first essay in my new collection of personal reflections, Everything and Nothing at All, that comes out in August 2024. So Pretty is an essay that is about thinking about beauty and fashion and ugliness and the ways that especially Asian femmes, but also transnationally and transracially adopted people are always being observed, and what it means to try to take back some of that narrative. Okay. 250,000 Korean adoptees lived around the world. We've been lost to, or in some people's opinion, stolen by, a transnational industry that fulfills a supply-demand relationship between comparatively wealthy, mostly white, adoptive parents and our less class-privileged, darker-skinned, darker-haired, darker-eyed families of origin. We, or the transaction rather, cost so much. Money our mothers, our families don't receive. Money that travels across national borders, geographic oceans and lands, cultural chasms, to the benefit of those with greater power. Money that flies around like imperceptible, ungraspable feathers, inconspicuous but, when collected, making up quite a mess. But those things, the industries and structures that continue to allow these exchanges, are untouchable, both literally and often politically. What is touchable are babies, the shells of small lives hollowed out for easier renovation. Aren't our black eyes so cute when they get pushed up by our cheeks as we grin for the photo displayed at the office? Don't we garner the most likes and commendatory comments on those mommy blogs when we're sent to elementary school show and tell in a hanbok? Our skin itching under unfamiliar crinoline smiles. And how about when we blossom into comely but not too popular teenagers, the best of both worlds, already imagined in our adoptive parents' alma mater stripes, saved from the unseemly fate of our birth? But what then, when shortly after we become grown Asian people all by ourselves, expected to navigate the ways our genders and sexualities and races collide, without any practice or community or guidance? What if, as it was in my generation, we had few popular culture role models and felt the ever-present white noise that implied we became desirable in part because of our undesirability, wanted because we were unwanted? What do we do at that moment when we transform into the uncontrollable exotic beauties of our own adoptive mother's worst nightmares? At the moment when we start to be the headliner and no longer the opening act, the sidekick, the stage prop, but also when we find ourselves alone and unprepared in a world that is already licking its lips. Here's my disconnect: the private and public self, my mind and body, the real person, and the curated spectacle of shilling it on the street, as my therapist said. What else is one to do when overcome by the hum of internalized racial hatred? Accept one's ugliness as fact, not systemic fiction? Turn in on oneself, or try to build a nest of beauty and aesthetics in which to hide? Can prettiness be an act of rebellion? Can something planted as an expectation, fed by insecurity, something that grows into a tangle of thorns, one day flower into play, desire, possibility, altogether unrecognizable and transformed? Can that transformation be true? Are there actual roots to which to fasten this performance to anything real?
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to share your story with us and your writing, and best of luck on your writing journey.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. And I'm excited to hear the other episodes of your podcast.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more upcoming episodes of the Artsy Raven about writing and publishing, visit us at jfgarrard.com/arpodcast. A reminder to Patreon subscribers that there is bonus content available for every episode on the Patreon website. If you enjoyed the show, you can show your appreciation by buying us some digital coffee. The Artsy Raven is produced by J.F. Garrard. The voice in the show's introduction is Chris Gorman, and music is by Tim Moore. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe.